Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Welcome back, Horror Heliacs! Today on Horror Heals, we're diving fang first into the mind of Bram Stoker Award-winning author Hailey Piper. If you're into monsters, body horror, or just downright twisted tales that leave you questioning reality, you are in for a treat. Or maybe even a trick. Hailey's not just redefining horror, she's twisting it, bending it, and sometimes setting it on fire. Her latest book, All the Hearts You Eat, is a chilling blend of ghosts, poetry, and vampires, set against the backdrop of a haunting Cape Cod town. Oh, and did we mention there's a vagina monster in one of her other novels? Yeah, buckle up. Horror is healing. And Hailey is here to tell us why embracing the macabre could actually help us face life's darkest shadows. Welcome to Horror Heals, Hailey.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Before we start talking about your exciting career as a horror author, I just kind of wanted to get a little perspective on how you feel about our subject matter, with horror being, good for mental wellness.
I completely agree. It's something, horror is healing is something I've been saying for years. It doesn't make sense to everyone, but it makes sense to me, and the people who understand that, it makes sense to them too. It's not a simple thing. Like, it sounds simple when you just throw it in like 3 words, and sometimes that's fine. Just don't explain. But other times it's, sometimes it can be a matter of that the horror subject matter is cathartic. There's a tweet just yesterday that was talking about how, hope can't exist in a vacuum. It needs despair. It's nothing. It's just, it's nothing without that. And horror is willing to go deeper into that than any genre. And whether it's through the text or medium, whatever the art happens to be, that finds some form of catharsis with the characters or triumph or whatever, or even, that is one form of healing. Another is just that even if it is some absolutely hopeless piece of horror media, like the Wicked and the Divine, for example, you still have control of that to come out of it. And my life isn't that. I'm still here. I survived the movie or the book or whatever. I think horror is primarily emotion based to me. And I think that in a way, it kind of prepares you a little emotionally. They did studies after the lockdown saying that horror fans were the most emotionally, what's the word? Not prepared, but just kind of had the most emotional resolve in dealing with that and kind of understanding the issues that were happening, the heaviness of it and weathering that. So I suppose in that sense, horror is healing, but it also is kind of a vaccine in itself, just kind of keeping you well enough to be able to handle things when they come at you.
And that's something we haven't really discussed on the podcast yet. Horror fans and isolation, I think, is they kind of go hand in hand. So, we were forced to be sort of isolated, from each other. I can see how we'd have the resolve to kind of get through it better than some people who really, I think that there's a lot of people still dealing with PTSD of the pandemic. Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. So what was your first introduction to horror? Was it literature? Was it film?
I'm sure it was just people telling stories. I have very vague memories of being very young and people telling scary stories around, I don't even remember what the subject matter was. It's just a vague, probably movies, just because a lot of the stuff that you read when you're little isn't usually geared in that direction. There might be some Halloween themed things, but again, just no memory of that. So stuff that was okay for me to watch, like Godzilla and things like that. Not okay for me to watch H.P. Lovecraft's The Unnameable, which is a hard R, late 80s horror movie with just things I should not have seen as a 5-year-old. I had nightmares for a week, but, I just kept coming back.
Yeah. When did your interest in writing begin?
I think when I was 7, just as far as, oh, this is something I like doing. I wanted to tell, I was telling stories already. So it was kind of just learning to write them down more as I was 8, but I didn't really know I wanted to be a writer until I was like a young teenager and I read Stephen King's It. I will always remember being up until 2 a.m, finishing the last couple hundred pages of the book and just being so stunned. I was exhausted out of my mind at that point. It was just like, I want to make people feel like this made me feel.
That was it that sort of kind of cemented that for you, because it's it's a super long book. It's heavy. Uncle Stevie takes us off of some crazy with the hallucinogen, all that crazy stuff in there.
I don't really have a problem suspending disbelief. So it was just I just took it at face value. He's always doing wild stuff, and I'm just like, I want to do wild stuff. I don't want it to just be, and this is not a knock against the movies necessarily, but I don't want everything to be The Conjuring. I want things to be weird shit too.
Stephen King certainly knows how to create some interesting monsters. And, I think monsters are definitely a theme in your work. What is it about the otherworldly vampires and creepy ghoulies that appeals to you?
I think on a very simple level, it's that they don't exist. So like that's immediately fascinating. But I've always liked monsters. Yeah, I'm drawn to creatures. I mean, in the same way I was an animal kid, so it kind of just extends from that. Really just like if you get to see a neat creature, that's awesome. Like that's something I've come to appreciate even more as an adult because we don't really get them as much anymore. So when something like Arcadian, I think that just came out this year with Nicolas Cage on Shudder. I wasn't wild about that movie, but like really interesting monsters in it that they don't explain ever in the entire movie. That it made them creepy and it made them interesting. And it's just like, it's just nice to get to see a creature. On a deeper level, I think that if you're somebody who's been an outsider at points, then you do identify sometimes with the monsters. Like there's ones like people will often reference like Frankenstein's monster, King Kong. For me, it was like the creature from the Black Lagoon. For some reason, I just really, the stuff that was going on with him is like, this is wrong. This is unjust. Like there's not like, so like when Guillermo del Toro talks about the creature from Black Lagoon, I'm like, you're like 100% right. Like, they come into his home and trash it. And then they drag him back to civilization and like, put him in a zoo. In the second movie, and the third one, they're trying to turn him into a human. And it's just like that whole trilogy is so fucked up.
As gay people, I think that we are drawn to characters like that because it's like, well, they've been trying to change us, forever. They're still trying to change us, and,
Exactly.
But yeah, you mentioned Guillermo. I thought The Shape of Water was just magical. I think Doug Jones should have been nominated for an Oscar for that.
They never, like him, Andy Serkis, like they never acknowledged that stuff. But it was a beautiful performance, a beautiful movie. That is exactly the mindset that I would like to approach each thing. Sometimes the creatures are just, they're nasty. They don't give a shit. But that's the thing. It's, you treat them like people. Some people are assholes. Some monsters are assholes.
So you have a new novel coming out in October. Let's talk a little bit about that.
All the Hearts You Eat is coming out October 15th from Titan Books. It is my, I've been blasting it about as my vampire novel. And I didn't realize before it was announced that people had apparently been waiting for me to write a vampire novel. So I guess that worked out. It takes place in a small town in Massachusetts, Cape Morning. It begins with a woman, Ivory Sloan, going out for a morning swim before work and encountering the dead body of a teenager, Cabrina Bright, and finding a poem that Cabrina clearly wrote. And it kind of just sets her off on trying to figure out what happened to this girl, especially when she starts seeing her ghost around the town. At the same time, Cabrina's friends are also seeing her and trying to figure out what's going on. They have a more occult mind for trying to figure out what's going on with like seances and ritual stuff. And And interspersed throughout the book are entries from Cabrina's diary to kind of slowly reveal the picture of what happened leading up to her death. But early enough in the book, Ivory stumbles upon something that's not of our world, and letting it in leads to all kinds of consequences as she searches for answers.
Awesome. Well, I think, a lot of these things are so cyclical. We see like a glut of, vampire stuff or zombie stuff or werewolf stuff. And I think, people were a little bit with all the Twilight movies, and not to slight those, and they've got their fandom, but I think people were kind of like over vampires for a bit. And I think it's time to, to bring vampires back into the fold. I thought the Midnight Mass show was a really interesting take on vampires and religion and all of that. And so, yeah, excited to see vampires coming back into the mix.
Yeah, I think it was starting to really pick up steam last year with Paul Tremblay's The Pallbearers Club, and Nat Cassidy's Nestlings, and Alexis Henderson's House of Hunger, and Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. And then this year, there's just been an explosion. I can't even keep track of everything, to be honest, because there have been so many. What's neat to me is that they're all very different approaches, though. Like, I have not seen two similar ways of looking at them. Some have been like vampires that are have been existing in the world and just trying to kind of fit in. Others who are very like dynastic and view humans as like their cattle or whatever. Ones that are just trying to have a good time. Ones that are very regal. Others that are very feral. So, there's all kinds of different approaches, and it's really interesting to see everybody kind of take to them the way they want to.
What are your thoughts on having your work adapted for the screen?
I mean, I'm open to it. I think a lot of writers would look at it that way. There are things happening behind the scenes, but unless it's like announced, I tend not to talk about it because I don't know what I'm allowed to say. And I'm not really a big fan of like vague tweeting stuff where it's just like, oh, this cool hat thing is happening, but I can't tell you about it. It's just like, okay, well, why are you saying anything then? So there's stuff going on. We'll see what happens. The only thing that's been announced is Tony Eldridge, the producer of the Equalizer movies, picking up the rights to A Light Most Hateful, my Titan book that came out last year. So everything else is like under the whatever the curtain or whatever. So I can't really talk about it, but I mean, I'm interested in it. I'm interested in seeing what filmmakers might interpret things as. Like, there's certain stuff that I'm like, yeah, this is not really negotiable. Like, but there's other things where it's just like, plots don't stay the same between books and movies a lot of the time. So it does happen. And some things that work for books don't work for movies and vice versa. It's like, I don't want to read a book that reads like a script, and I don't want to watch a movie that's paced like a book. It's interesting. It's funny. When I was younger, I used to read the book and then see the movie, and I'd end up disappointed by the movie. Nowadays, sometimes I watch the movie and then I read the book, and the book is it's nice to have the two, like Annihilation, extremely different between the book and movie, but I love them both for different reasons. Or something like Legion by William Peter Blatty that became The Exorcist 3. Very similar, probably because he wrote and directed the movie. But it's kind of like you just get more of the movie. It's expanded.
Right. There's room in a novel for much more detail and additional scenes and things like that.
Right. And like you get into the character's head in ways that you can't in a movie. It's different art forms, different mediums, and it's interesting to watch people explore the same source material, the same material in different ways.
I think as long as it, credits the other, I think more exposure is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as long as the spirit of the thing is maintained between the two, that matters a lot. Sometimes not. I haven't read this book, but I've heard that like American Psycho, the movie is very like antithetical to the book. I don't know. I love the movie, so I'm like not sure if I'm going to check out the book ever, but you never know. I think the important thing is to have artists at the forefront, regardless of what the medium is, not necessarily people crunching numbers and deciding, well, this is the thing that'll make people like it the most. And it's like, I don't worry about that when I'm writing a book. I don't worry about what people are going to like. And I know a movie's different because there's like a lot more money riding on it. And, you've got a couple hundred people, possibly a couple thousand, depending on the movie, working on it. So you can't just be like, who cares what people think? This is art. I think you need a little of that to maintain authenticity.
As a queer person, how much responsibility do you feel for, creating realistic gay characters in your work? And do you feel like, okay, I'm going to, this person is gay because it's right for the character and not necessarily having to have, gay characters in every piece of your work?
I do. So there's that. But I think that's less about me thinking about it beforehand and more just because that's just how I see things. That's just a natural extension of my perspective that they end up being queer characters. I don't put as much thought into it as people probably think I do. It's just what comes naturally to me. I would have to, because I'll have characters, because I usually when I'm writing characters, like when I'm conceptualizing characters, it's very neutral. And then while I'm starting to write them, it's like, oh, they're gay or, oh, they're trans or, whatever. Like it's something, and it happens very early, but it's not something that's a decision, more of a discovery. I think that if I were trying to decide it, I don't know, I think that would paralyze me creatively, to be honest, because I would be trying to be like, well, which representation have I not shown yet? And what is good representation or et cetera? I don't worry about that stuff. I just want to write people.
Interesting, because I know that, one of my favorites, book and the movie, is Silence of the Lambs, and some people consider it horror and some people don't. And there's, been a lot of discussion about the Buffalo Bill character, and how that's, presenting, queer people in a negative light, as a serial killer. But I just see that that's a character. I mean, there's some evil gay people. Sorry, it's true.
I think it's a little harder to measure sometimes when it is a non-queer person handling that kind of material. And it's also difficult because, there can be nothing wrong with the movie itself, for example, or book or whatever, and people still take it a certain way. Cause like, that's one of those things where like, that is like a fantastic movie, but also have to acknowledge some of the damage it did back in the early 90s. It's not a simple thing. I'm in an easier position being a queer person writing it, that I'm just because, how do I put this? A lot of the time, if there is an evil queer person or a harmful queer person in my work, they're not the only queer person. And that's kind of where that comes. It's not like, oh, this one's good, this one's a hero. It's like, no, they're just a person. They do some things right and some things wrong, like all of us. So it's really just, again, it's really just about showing, like, writing humans. Again, I do think there might be some more responsibility on like straight cis creators when they're handling this material. As far as what's the answer to that, I don't know. I don't think there is one answer. I think it's something that happens on a case by case basis. And a lot of stuff we revisit sometimes, and it's funny for something like, for example, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, where a lot of queer people who watch that, especially if they're younger, feel seen, whereas there are other queer people who feel insulted because there is no monolith for any marginalized group. And so what's your responsibility then? It's just like, you do your best. Like, it's just, if you acknowledge that you're probably going to screw something up, and you just kind of do better. And it's just, and then you have to classify what better is. Maybe that's not even possible. We can't worry about everything too much. Like we only have so much time in this world to create so much art. So I think if you're trying to do your best and trying not to cause real world harm, like that's the best I got, honestly. Like we just try.
I don't know how much stock you put into accolades and awards, but I do think the Bram Stoker Award is cool as hell. Can you?
Oh, it is heavier than it looks. It is like, this is a chunky thing. It's like, it takes some effort for me to pick up, at least.
What was that experience like for you? And then just finding out that you won.
It was terrifying, more so than books, I think, because I had a 100% certainty that I was not going to win, because I was like, this is a Vagina monster book. What are they going to give like the freaking Bram Stoker Award to this? So I was kind of not taking it seriously. I was just like, yeah, it's cool to be nominated. And my story recitation of the first feeding was nominated for long fiction. So it's like, yeah, it's cool. I 2 Bram Stoker nominations. That's awesome. Then when I sat down for the awards and they started doing like the opening, and then the opening was fine. And then when they started actually doing the awards, I was just like, oh God, this is real. I might actually win this. I didn't have stuff prepared. So I was like quickly tapping out an acceptance speech just in case. So at least I did have something when I went up there, but I was shaking the whole time. I couldn't find my way to stage. It was just a mess. Yeah. I was on stage the next year to present an award. That's a lot easier. That's much easier. That it's like the attention is on you in a different way. People are just waiting for you to get done talking so that they can find out who won. That's a lot easier.
Kendall and I debate this often about, what place comedy has in horror. I feel like that there's a lot of gray area there. I mean, when you're writing a novel about, as you said, a vagina monster, I mean, it's you can only take it so seriously. And in fact, when I was reading about the book, I'm like, it immediately made me think of, I performed with a sketch comedy troupe back in St. Louis for several years and had this bizarre bad grandma character called Mima. And she goes to the dentist and is experiencing vagina dentata. And it gets very ridiculous very quickly. Can you just talk a little bit about the concept of that book and why you went there?
So the original concept was that it was going to be numerous people. Like this is going to be kind of a disease that was spreading around, that people are getting vagina dentata. That kind of got shifted a little so that it was involving the people who had multiple sets of DNA in their system because of a separate virus created by this pharmaceutical company that led to them. Half of their DNA is essentially owned, like the IP of this pharmaceutical company. And because of that is what leads to the main character, Yaya, finding teeth in her vagina after a one-night stand. At that point, once I'd shifted to there, I mean, there is dark humor through the book because it takes place in an alternate present where Nancy Reagan became president after Ronald Reagan. And so we're in a kind of separate timeline from that point. So there's a lot of room for humor just based on the setting. Like one part implies Charlton Heston became the Secretary of Defense. Yeah, there's like the main character is her fixation is Looney Tunes. She doesn't like to watch movies. She doesn't like to read books. She just likes to watch cartoons. So there's a lot of humor through the book that is kind of to help. Like we were talking at the beginning, hope doesn't work without despair. In this case, the humor is to help kind of accentuate how grim this is, that this world where you don't have this full autonomy, kind of like, another world we're familiar with. It is a satire, but as far as a lot of that stuff goes, it's also a horror book in the sense that, she's dealing with this body horror that's happening to her. It's also a romance because her and the vagina monster growing in her both form an attachment to the woman who's supposed to be hunting them, who works for the pharmaceutical company. So there's a lot going on in the book. But yeah, there's humor, there's love, there's scary stuff, there's gross stuff. It's very funny seeing the different reactions because some people will be like, that was the most disturbing book I ever read. Like, I can't believe. And some people like, that was so sweet. I've never felt so like heart touched by a book before. Like it's very, very opposite reactions to that book, depending on the person.
Who wouldn't want to see a rom-com with a vagina monster, right?
It's fun also when I'm at events, people who have not heard of Queen of Teeth, picking up the book and just seeing the expressions on their faces when they read the back and like they realize what it's about.
Our final question that we ask every guest is, who is your favorite final person in a horror movie?
No, it's hard because there's so many good ones. Damn it. Like I'm tempted to say Nancy Thompson from A Nightmare on Elm Street. I have to go with Kirsty from Hellraiser because the thing is, a lot of the final people are very nice people. And I just love that she is just gutter mouthed and like not giving shit and bitchy. And like she fucking makes a deal with the Cenobites. It's just like, she is just like that's what I mean when I'm like a person, like a whole person as the character is like Kirsty. And in the movie, the book version of her is much more like what you'd expect like a final person to be. The movie version though is just like, it's just very grounded and like, you know, like clawing and scratching and biting her way to not be taken over through this and not die from this or be taken by the Cenobites. So yeah, I'd have to go with her, I guess, if push came to shove.
Well, we love hearing people's answers because it really makes us think about a different perspective for the character and immediately makes us want to revisit the movie, although Hellraiser's a little pretty violent in most cases. But
oh, really? Okay. That's one of my favorite movies. That's me with the Blob, the Blob remake. Oh, I love it. I love what they did with it, but I'm like, there are a lot of points where I'm like, I have to close my eyes a little bit. It's too much.
Cool. Well, Hailey, thank you so much for coming on. And again, sending out the good vibes for the new book.
Appreciate it.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for having me on. This is great.
Wow, Hailey, you've truly given us and our listeners a lot to think about. Horror as catharsis, as a vaccine for emotional resilience, and as a vehicle for human connection. It's all so deliciously dark. Thank you for showing us that monsters aren't just terrifying, they're relatable. Whether it's Frankenstein's creature or a certain dentata-inclined entity, they remind us that even the weirdest parts of ourselves have a story worth telling. And to our listeners, grab a copy of All the Hearts You Eat, if you dare. It's available now. And remember, when someone asks, is horror good for mental wellness? You tell them, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.